Welcome, everyone. Silverado Policy Accelerator is thrilled to have you with us here tonight for this event on competing with China, opportunities for U.S. and Australia cooperation. We have an all-star cast with us this evening, each of whom is helping to lead the charge to promote peace and democracy throughout the world while countering the malign influence of the Chinese Communist Party. I'd like first to introduce Australia's 29th Prime Minister and Honorary Chair of Silverado Strategic Council, Malcolm Turnbull. Prime Minister Turnbull served as Australia's Prime Minister from 2015 through 2018, where he led the implementation of a number of landmark policies, including the nation's first ever cybersecurity strategy, the passage of foreign interference legislation, and the revival of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. Prime Minister Turnbull is also a successful businessman and a strategic advisor. It's truly a pleasure to have you join us, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're also joined by Congressman John Katko, representative for New York's 24th Congressional District and ranking member of the House Committee on Homeland Security, where he has worked to advance legislation to strengthen our nation's cyber defenses and strengthen counterterrorism efforts. Congressman Katko also sits on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and is a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus. Prior to his service in Congress, Congressman Katko spent over 20 years as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Department of Justice. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Congressman.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. As is typical in Washington, schedules change on a dime, and unfortunately, our last speaker, Congressman Ami Bera from California's 7th Congressional District, will not be able to join us in person this evening. He has sent a video, which we'll play shortly, however, to express his views on this important topic, and we're grateful for his time and attention. Congressman Bera serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he chairs a subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and nonproliferation. He's also a senior member of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Prior to his service in Congress, Mr. Bera worked as a physician and public health official for over 20 years. Gentlemen, we're looking forward to hearing your perspective this evening and to having a lively discussion. At any time throughout the event, we welcome the audience to submit questions using the Q&A function, and we'll reserve some time at the end to turn to those. We're also live streaming this on YouTube and recording the event, which we'll make available on our website. Before we jump in, I'd like to share a little bit about our newly launched bipartisan nonprofit, Silverado Policy Accelerator. As the world competes for the newest technologies, the smartest economies, and the broadest sphere of influence, the nations that assert bold, long-term strategies will shape the global order for decades to come. At this pivotal moment of geopolitical competition, the United States must work with its allies like Australia to chart a course towards economic prosperity at home and competitiveness on the world stage. Maureen and I started Silverado to help forge that path by working to identify the best solutions to critical policy challenges and then incubating and accelerating those ideas into concrete results. We're already full steam ahead with our launch in February with projects underway in each of our pillars: cybersecurity, international trade and industrial security, and economic and ecological security. A cross-cutting theme across all Silverado's pillars is great power competition, the theme of our event tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
To frame things a little for everyone, the United States and Australia, steadfast allies located on opposite sides of the world's largest ocean, share a long-standing friendship and economic and strategic partnership. Since the 20th century, Australia has fought alongside Americans in every major U.S. military conflict and remained a vital partner in promoting peace and stability around the world. Today, the United States and Australia are confronted with a 21st century challenge: the rise of China as a global economic and strategic superpower. As tensions rise on a number of fronts between the United States and between Australia and China, the United States and Australia are grappling with what strategies are needed at home and abroad to safeguard our respective national security, counter unfair and often nefarious measures, and maintain global competitiveness. In just the last 5 years, the United States has imposed tariffs on over $300 billion of Chinese goods, restricted exports to countless entities, banned certain Chinese products made with forced labor, sanctioned Chinese government officials and companies over human rights abuses, rejected China's maritime claims in the South China Sea, explored diversification of critical supply chains, and has a spate of pending legislation aimed at countering Chinese government threats. For its part, China has denounced these moves and has taken a range of retaliatory measures, including imposition of tariffs on U.S. exports and new rules banning Chinese firms and citizens from complying with unjustified foreign laws and sanctions. Australia and China are also squaring off. Australia has condemned China's treatment of the Uyghurs, and under Prime Minister Turnbull's leadership, Australia was the first Western country to ban Huawei from its 5G networks. Despite China being Australia's largest trading partner, Beijing is restricting and imposing duties on Australian exports of coal, barley, and wine, and other products following Australia's call for an investigation into the origins of the COVID pandemic. Further escalations in recent months have led to Australia announcing it will take action in the WTO over China's imposition of anti-dumping duties on Australian wine. In early May, the Chinese government announced it will no longer engage in economic dialogue with Australia. As we take stock of these measures, we need to ask ourselves, are they enough? What more can we be doing individually and collectively? What are the key areas for deepening cooperation? Supply chain resiliency, protection of critical infrastructure, international trade policy, and the rules of cyberspace. With that frame, I would like to invite each of our speakers to provide a brief opening remark, and then we'll move on to the moderated discussion. Mr. Prime Minister, let's start with you.
Right. Thank you very much, Maureen, and thank you, Dimitri, so much for your leadership in establishing this foundation. Look, this is really this is such an important thing. We need to have more discussions, and one of the benefits, I suppose, if you can call it that, of the pandemic, is that we're getting much more used to doing webinars like this, and it does enable us to conquer the tyranny of distance. So thank you, and it's great to also be joined, I see, by David Petraeus, who is a co-chair of the foundation, and also, unless it may even be that our mutual friend Michael Rogers, Admiral Rogers, is on the call. I'm not sure whether that's true, but there's a Michael Rogers there, and let me start with that. Look, the Australian U.S. alliance is one of the there's no closer alliance, put it that way. The ANZUS, we have an ANZUS treaty between Australia, New Zealand, and the US, which is a mutual defence treaty. So if US interests were attacked in the Pacific, Australia would come to America's aid, and vice versa. So it's very tight. Our armed forces are, as David Petraeus knows very well firsthand, are interoperable, and that is when I say interoperable, I don't mean that they're simply able to operate in a deconflicted way. They can operate together seamlessly. So we have the same weapon systems and so forth. So that is that's critically important. In the area of cyber, where Dimitri, you have been such a leader, and in every respect, technically, policy-wise, intellectually, and I salute you for that. That is probably where our two countries work most closely together. I think, as Michael Rogers knows, the Australian Signals Directorate, our equivalent to the NSA, while much smaller than the NSA, or indeed GCHQ in the UK, does box above its weight. It is a very formidable group, and definitely the most distilled centre of sheer intellectual horsepower in Canberra, which is saying a lot of smart people there, so that's saying a lot. In terms of China, look, China blew it, in my view, in a foreign policy point of view. I mean, when Trump was president, Trump was erratic, he was belligerent, he unsettled long-standing alliances. He was flaky, frankly. I had a lot to do with him, obviously. And his best friend would have to say that, although apparently you can't say anything like that in the GOP nowadays, unless you're very courageous. But the reality is that was an opportunity for China to be un-Trump-like, to be consistent, measured, conciliatory, and instead they have become, under Xi Jinping, more aggressive than ever. And they're acting like bullies. I mean, the taking over these islands in the South China Sea was obviously very provocative, in breach of international law. That when people protested about it, when countries protested about it, China reacted with enormous indignation. I mean, they have a brittle, there's a sort of brittle insecurity going on with the Chinese Communist Party where they overreact to criticism. You know, I mean, people say terrible things about the United States. Americans say terrible things about the United States. Australians say terrible things about Australia. Do we get bent out of shape? No. But you criticize what's going on in Xinjiang or Hong Kong or the South China Sea, and the reaction is this over-the-top performative tantrum that is simply designed to intimidate people. And that's what we've got at the moment with Australia. I mean, we have a huge trade, positive trade balance with China. It's actually never been as big as it is today because of iron ore. But every export category that they felt they could source from somewhere else without undue cost, they have penalized. So as you ran through at the outset, barley, wine, lobsters. Lobsters are good value in Australia at the moment, and keep drinking that Australian wine. It's beef, coal for a while. I mean, no ministerial communication. So what has Australia done to earn this displeasure? Basically, the high point of the relationship, I suppose, in terms of amicability was probably about 2015, 2016. But then my government, I introduced and legislated foreign influence and foreign interference legislation, because there's, frankly, our laws are out of date. We didn't have a FARA equivalent, and there was an enormous Chinese foreign influence operation going on in Australia through the United Front Work Department. And it's not particular. It's only somewhat covert. It's pretty open, and it's designed to obviously influence foreign governments and foreign political parties, and mobilize the Chinese diaspora. And our attitude was, we said, well, look, we're a free country. Anyone can express points of view they like here, but we will not tolerate covert, corrupt, or coercive conduct, right? So that's basically what we prohibited. And I made the point in my speech that when I introduced it into the House, that just as modern China was founded by Mao Zedong saying the Chinese people have stood up, and that was an expression of sovereignty and pride and assertion. So the Australian people say we stand up too. Our sovereignty is important to us. Well, this caused great resentment in Beijing. And they had to wear it. And they used a lot of influence to try to stop the legislation getting through our Senate, which the government didn't control, hardly ever does. But we managed to get it through. There's quite a bit about it in my memoir, A Bigger Picture, if you're interested. But then came the issue of Huawei. And look, this is I hope something we can discuss here. I have a sort of a background in telecoms and signals intelligence in a sort of amateur way. But I was very concerned about 5G because it's different. It is different to previous wireless, technologies or protocols or systems. It's much more virtualized, much more distributed, I think much more vulnerable to interference. And you can't really distinguish between the core and the radio access network in the way that you used to be able to. Mike Rogers could explain that much better than me. Anyway, we looked at every which way we could mitigate the Huawei risk, absolutely every which way, and came to the conclusion that we couldn't. So it wasn't a political decision. It was simply a risk assessment. We were in effect, we weren't saying there's a smoking gun, we're saying there's a loaded gun. And we were bearing in mind that a threat is the combination of capability and intent. Capability takes a long time to put in place, intent can change in a heartbeat. So even if you assumed that the people in Huawei were good guys, that the Chinese government bore us nothing but goodwill. The fact that you'd have that sort of capability in the hands of a company that was entirely controlled by the Communist Party in China, it's just too much of a risk. Anyway, well, that was a big deal, right? And I remember Trump, when I told Trump about it, he was surprised. We'd actually gone that far. I'd been talking to him and Mike Pence, and of course, above all, Michael Rogers, earlier about it for some time, in fact. The real big issue I think for America, and this is I think the key issue, is how did America get to the point where if a US telco wants to move to 5G, it's basically got 4 vendors to buy from. 2 Chinese, Huawei and ZTE as a sort of runner-up, and from Europe, Nokia and Ericsson. You know, there isn't an American company, there isn't a British company, a Japanese company, let alone an Australian one. You know, there's got to be, you've got to have, you know, we are great knockers of industry policy and dirigisme in the English-speaking world, but you know, you can't be asleep at the switch, excuse the pun. Anyway, that sort of, there was the pushback and resentment against that was enormous. After I left office in 2018, things have got worse. The overreaction to Scott Morrison's request for there to be an investigation into the COVID, you know, virus is literally crackers, absolutely crackers. I mean, all of us who are involved in politics and public affairs know that if the Chinese had simply ignored it, or said something, you know, anodyne, like, yeah, sure, the World Health Organization should have an inquiry and we'll cooperate with it, it would have been 2 paragraphs on page 89. What made it a story and an issue was the crazy overreaction. I mean, at some point, you've got to have the discernment to let things, as we say in cricketing, in the cricketing countries, let things go through to the keeper. You know, don't have a swing at it, just ignore it. But it's this, and the message that you're getting from Beijing is, you cross us in the slightest way, particularly if you're a smaller country like Australia, and we'll come down on you like a ton of bricks. So the bottom line is that we need much, you know, we are very solid. I think the particularly, you know, all of the consequences of this have been America and Australia are closer than ever, which, I mean, it's hard to get any closer, frankly. But the Quad has revived, and this is something that got started about a decade or more ago, and then fell into, you know, I don't know, neglect. I revived it with Trump and Modi and Shinzo Abe in 2017, and now it's you know, it's up and running again. Now it's got a long way to go. It's not an alliance, but the fact that Japan, Australia, US, and India are sitting down and talking strategy, national security issues in the constructive way we are today is a very big move, particularly given India's long-standing policy of non-alignment. So, you know, look, there's a lot, I won't go on, but I just want to say thank you to all of our American friends. I think the relationship is as close as it can be. I guess it could always be closer, but it is, you know, we share the same values. We have, you know, the same goals: free, open, Indo-Pacific, maintaining the rule of law, and ensuring that might isn't right. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. Now on to you, Congressman Katko.
Well, thank you very much. And Prime Minister, I just want to echo your sentiments about the friendship between our countries and the like-mindedness of how we view the world. And I think you really aptly summed up some of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit. And that really has to evolve around some of the changing dynamics that we now have. We are becoming ever more aware of the fact that the world has changed, and the power dynamics and assumptions about our long-term prosperity, our resilience and security have dramatically changed. And with your perspective and your long-term ally, Australia, as well as both Dimitri and Maureen, who I applaud for having the vision to start Silverado, and giving us a forum to all be here today to talk about this. It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. I'd like to share some of my views on the state of play in the homeland here and how we must acknowledge a shift in both our own thinking and how we must adapt to a new, more connected and more competitive world. And I have several observations I want to make. And the first one is that we are losing our strategic geographic advantage because of cyber actors. The homeland has never been more vulnerable to foreign incursions in our history. The big four nation states are only getting more sophisticated as hybrid threats redefine the attack surface through the convergence of IT, OT, disinformation, and by leveraging the inherently insecure nature of the internet and technology for their own geopolitical goals. The second point is that our global interconnectedness has created new and potentially catastrophic domestic resilience vulnerabilities, which we've seen play out over the last several months in the United States. Economic security and homeland security are inexorably linked due to the critical role that supply chain resilience plays in our homeland security mission. But where these vulnerabilities lie also exist opportunities to reach beyond our borders and build up global resilience to bad actors like China. The United States' long and enduring alliance with Australia is an example of an international democratic nexus that can be leveraged against modern threats to our homeland security. And the third point I want to make is that we don't fully appreciate, nor do we know how to value data we generate and export from a security standpoint. This is such a vulnerability for us. Technology presents us challenges and opportunities. And it's not just opportunities, and that's what we have to recognize. It contains both the catalyzing problems and the solutions to threats we now face. We need to start asking questions about how, as a society, we are valuing that data, what we care about and what we don't, be that from a privacy or a monetization or a security standpoint, and having some tough discussions about what steps we need to take once data that we feel absolutely have to be protected or preserved, both now and into the future. And finally, and I probably think most importantly, this is probably the most important thing, is coming from somebody who was a federal organized crime prosecutor for 20 years. Our entire concept of homeland security is predicated on the notion of abrupt, violent shocks. I prosecuted a lot of them. We must adjust to a long-term, multifaceted threat landscape where abrupt, violent shocks aren't the norm. We must break down silos, improve information sharing. And these efforts are still as imperative to homeland security as they were post 9/11, but now the scope of information is much larger and more nebulous. Threats are slow moving. They involve commercial markets and non-martial action, and now more often exist in realms of technical jargon, specialized industry, or in the case of propaganda, the very minds of our citizenry. This brings us to the focal point of our conversation today. How do we manage these threats in the face of increasing intimidation efforts that the Prime Minister so eloquently laid out by China? Between their economic buildup and coercive statecraft, human rights violations and IP theft and cyber warfare, how do we stand up to China over the next 50 years as the nation continues to amass power in the global community? This is the enormous question, and one that demonstrates a need for a whole of nation recognition that to compete with China and emerge victorious, clear-eyed focus on the challenges we face must be at the forefront of every conversation about both the security and prosperity of our nation. I think there are three elements we can use to frame that conversation. I call them the 3 C's. It's counter, curb, and compete. Let's talk about counter for a moment. We must impose costs to deter or disincentivize actions by the Communist Party globally. These may include prohibiting key exports from leaving our shores, holding accountable PRC nationals violating our laws, and taking reciprocal action in response to cyber incursions and theft of intellectual property and data. And the next thing, curb. In the United States, we must educate state, local municipalities about the threats they face from China via these partnerships, these financial transactions, and these business acquisitions. There must be a more robust dialogue with business leaders about the impacts of doing business in and with China. And most importantly, we need to recognize that the decisions we make now will have outsized impacts down the line. China is playing the long game, and we do not do a good job of doing that ourselves. We must focus on long-term results as well. And the third thing is we need to compete. Ultimately, this isn't a binary challenge. There's no home and away game anymore. And if we intend to challenge Chinese actions and their bullying tactics, we need to recognize that tactics they employ internationally will ultimately affect the US domestically. We need to work with partners and allies around the world, like Australia, to determine how we are going to convince entities and nations that it's not in their interest to work with China on foreign investment, supply chain diversity, ICT technology proliferation, data security, and a multitude of other issues. Most of all, we need to provide viable alternatives and competitive solutions in the face of cheap and heavily subsidized Chinese goods and services. It is vital that leaders in the United States government develop clear messaging towards China by speaking up and speaking clearly about topics like human rights and their abhorrent human rights record, to shift the focus back to the reality of what the CCP is and what they really stand for, and that is to retain power. Sadly, public condemnation doesn't appear to be enough to impact the Communist Party actions, and it further demonstrates their thin-skinned and departure from international norms and liberal democratic values. And because of this, the United States and democracies around the world, like Australia, must impose costs to try and alter their behavior in a way that will materially impact their actions and give the global business community principles to rally around. Though it may be news to some here today, the Department of Homeland Security, of which I oversee, plays an essential role in this conversation. For example, Homeland Security has several tools at its disposal to leverage, and I hope it will continue to leverage them. That will signal to the global community that action will be taken against wrongdoing by the Communist Party. The most significant direct action taken to date by the United States government has, ironically, been the Department of Homeland Security. Since the beginning of fiscal year 20, we have issued 11 withhold release orders related to China, including 3 specifically pertaining to the forced labor in the Xinjiang province. Goods produced by Uyghur forced labor originated from China and was disseminated into the global textile and renewables chain. Now, US ports of entry detain those shipments because of what we're doing. There is also the established networks of Homeland Security has to educate stakeholders and publish guidance about things like securing ICT technology. The global 5G campaign to prohibit Huawei technology was poised to make the world dependent on China telecom infrastructure, is a prime example of how the department can drive action across a wide breadth of public and private entities, both in and out of the United States. And we've been fairly successful doing that. Perhaps the most pressing issue facing the homeland and our long-term security is the security of our economy. And safeguarding the critical infrastructure sector is a core aspect of the Homeland Security mission that impacts a wide range of industries vital to the daily lives of Americans. Homeland Security must focus on supply chain resilience and cogent industrial security policies as the core of the security mission. Put simply, economic security is Homeland Security. And it's important enough to say it again. Economic security is Homeland Security. And to do this, we must do several things with speed, intensity, and focus. So I'm just going to touch on a few of them here before I wrap up. Identify weaknesses in the resiliency of the public and private sectors and their ability to recover from disaster events. We must also ensure they have the ability to overcome domestic scarcity of goods due to single source foreign suppliers and industry-wide overconcentration of supply from one country. If the pandemic taught us anything, it taught us that. And we need to protect the nation from peer or near peer competitors who look to exploit international systems and norms to gain an asymmetric access to US market and further their own industrial and geopolitical agendas. We must account for both future crises and potential conflicts. The United States must ensure that we have the goods and infrastructure we need to be resilient, prosper, and remain the world's marketplace of democracy. We need to gauge our ability to access critical markets and that the availability of goods will remain robust. I'm not advocating for protectionism at all, but we must work with the private sector to ensure that economic security is factored into determinations that grant access to and allow supply chain formation in the businesses of a foreign adversary. We just heard from the Prime Minister telling us how China was trying to figure out ways not to do business with them. We have to protect against that. We're at a turning point in the history of the world. Never before has the globe been simultaneously so interconnected and also so divided. We're living in a time when we are able to know and watch the impact of geopolitical actions like the Uyghurs unfold in real time and trace them down to their effect on our citizens. I believe in the power of democracy with all my heart. I believe that capitalism and individual freedom is forces for good and that bolstering them allows for more secure and prosperous nations. It's time we reinforce them both at home and abroad with our great allies like Australia and others in the Quad and others great democracies around the world. And friends, and combat any who seek to erode and replace these well-proven principles. May have been a little strong talk for this forum, but I think it's important that we talk about it and lay down that marker. And I thank you very much. I look forward to today's discussion. I want to reiterate once again what an honor it is to be with such a great leader like Prime Minister Turnbull. And thank you very much, folks. And I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Congressman, and thank you for your leadership. We'd like to now hear from Chairman Bear, who is coming to us via video.
Hi, I'm Congressman Ami Bera from California's 7th Congressional District, also chairman of the House Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation. I want to thank the Silverado Accelerator for inviting me to be part of this event. I was hoping that I'd be there in person, but since you're seeing this video, that means I'm still in a markup of the EAGLE Act, which is a major House Foreign Affairs bill that does look at how the United States is going to approach China, the very topic that you're talking about today. So unfortunately, I'm still in that markup and was not able to join you, but do want to share some of my thoughts on this important issue. You know, as we look at the 21st century and the great power competition that's brewing not just between the United States and China, but also between like-minded allies like Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Korea, and China, we have to think about it in the context of the values and the values that bind Australia and the United States together, as well as other mature and leading democracies. Their values of free markets, freedom of navigation, of freedom of movement of goods and services. And when we think about this power competition, certainly China looms in the background as having a different set of values, but we also have to think about the values that will lead the 21st century. As such, I think it is very important that we build strong alliances and partnerships that are built on these values, again, of democracy, of freedom, of human rights, of the rules-based order of movement of goods and services. I think we can do that. I've been impressed with the Biden administration's early outreach to the region, both in the 2x2s that have taken place in Korea and Japan, but also the elevation of the Quad dialogue to the leaders level, where Australia, Japan, and India were able to work together to come up with concrete measures, in this case to address COVID-19. Obviously, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and I think that presents a unique opportunity for the United States, along with the G7 nations and other leading democracies, to address and help the world beat COVID-19. You know, some of the vaccine partnerships that came out of the G7, you know, some of what's come out of the U.S.-Korea summit can set a foundation for additional opportunities where it's not just about China, but it's about doing the right thing to defeat the pandemic and provide some of the smaller Asian nations an alternative to China. Now, on our subcommittee, we're very much focused on protecting maritime security and freedom of navigation. This is something that we had many conversations with our friends in Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands, Japan, Korea about. And it is extremely urgent because at this point in time, we don't have to guess the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping has clearly stated what his ambitions are and what China's ambitions are. I wish they were going in a different direction, but again, you see a much more authoritarian, centralized power in China that does not look to deal with that rules-based order that I was recently talking about. As we move forward in the 21st century, we will be much better and stronger if we work together as allies, as like-minded and like-valued countries. Not, again, to directly counter China, but to come together to provide the nations in Asia, as well as throughout the world, a different set of rules and authorities and the ability to move goods and services and thrive. We saw this liberal world order work very well in the post-World War II era, where millions were lifted out of poverty, where you rebuilt Europe, you rebuilt Japan, you created thriving economies in Korea and Australia and elsewhere. there's no reason that continuing on this path where you tap into the entrepreneurial spirit of the countries that form this coalition to move forward. And you're seeing countries like India, as they elevate their partnership in the Quad, continue to provide that opportunity for us. So, again, my apologies for not being able to join you this afternoon. I do look forward to working with my friends in Australia and throughout the region as we move forward to create a 21st century where we can all thrive together in competition, but also in peace. Thank you, and be well and be safe, everyone.
But let me start with some questions. So, Mr. Prime Minister, as Australia is facing this onslaught right now from China, particularly in the trade area, but in other areas as well, what do you think Australian government and frankly the Australian people would like to see the most from America right now in terms of support?
Well, really, just continued solidarity. I mean, and look, this will be politically difficult. It could be politically difficult. Now, let's say China says, right, in order to put the squeeze on the Australians, we're not going to buy any beef from Australia. Now, they have done that, by the way. It hasn't made an impact. Beef prices are very high. But let's say they did that. Could the US government discourage American beef producers from filling the gap? You see, the Chinese strategy is to divide, is to split Australia off. I mean, I'm not being suppositious here. I know that, and of course it's been absolutely counterproductive. I mean, the Quad. When I first started reviving the Quad with Modi, must have been in 2016, I guess, and he and the Indian system were pretty skeptical because, for a whole bunch of reasons. And they, now look, it's not an alliance. I mean, America is not an ally of India. America is an ally of Australia and Japan, but it is not an ally of India, but we're getting closer. And those of you that follow the trajectory of Russian arms sales and IP cooperation with China will realize that, will know that, the Indians have a big question. Their whole, and again, the admirals and the generals on the call will have a better understanding of this than me, but, they've historically bought their military equipment from Russia, and their adversary, their only realistic adversary, they have a neuralgic anxiety about Pakistan, but the two countries are so mismatched, it's hard to believe they'll get back into a conflict. But their big anxiety is China, and yet their main arms supplier is becoming more and more entwined with China. So there's a lot of potential there. But the most important thing is solidarity. I mean, you take the South China Sea. I mean, obviously, what you would, there is an international law. China's in breach of it. The arbitral tribunal in The Hague has determined that after the Philippines, case. But what China seeks to do is to pick one of the littoral states off after another. So they deal with the Vietnamese, and they deal with the Philippines, and they deal with Malaysia, and so forth. What we need is greater solidarity. And I mean, look, I think to give President Biden credit and Secretary Blinken credit, I mean, that's exactly what they're doing. So we just have to push back. I mean, if in the Chinese system there was room for diversity of opinion and debate, somebody would be saying to President Xi, look, Mr. President or Mr. General Secretary, this is not working. You are literally achieving the reverse of what you want to achieve. But I mean, Kurt Campbell made this point the other day, and I think he's right. I would not foresee a change in Chinese attitude for quite some time. I mean, the paradox about China is that they've defied all of our expectations. We thought as they became more economically advanced and wealthier, they would become more liberal. I mean, Bill Clinton said that when they admitted to the WTO. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. It's much more authoritarian, much more lockdown, much more of a surveillance state now than ever. And all of the technology that we all thought would liberate the world has been, in fact, used as a means of oppression, which just goes to show that there's nothing moral or immoral about technology. The moral part of it resides in the human beings that use it.
Great, thank you. Now, we do have a question from the audience, Mr. Cacto, Representative Cacto. The question is, you're going through a markup of legislation on China right now in the House Foreign Relations Committee. Chairman McCall has offered a slew of amendments that would strengthen export controls, address vulnerabilities through revision of the Berman Amendment, combat China's anti-foreign sanctions law and blocking statutes, and promote cooperation with and accountability for allies on export controls on semiconductor equipment, a very important issue, I might add. Yet Democrats are voting en bloc against these amendments and advancing high watered down pieces of legislation. Is the concern really bipartisan, and what are your expectations for China's legislation on China in the House?
I think it's going to be a tough sled going forward, but I think we got to take a step back and understand what China is attempting to do. And the Prime Minister talked about it. That they're not going to change their way. This is part of their long-term strategy, their 50-year plan, if you will. And they're executing to what they think they need to do. And they couldn't give a darn what we think about them from a political standpoint. So I think, one of my big concerns about the export controls is companies in the United States sometimes are dealing with their own interests and they take into account some of the implications of what they do with those when they make those business decisions. I've seen it here in my own district, let alone all across the country. So what we've got to do, and what's so important about what we're doing today with Silverado, is kind of trying to start that education of there's a bigger thing at play here, and trying to get people on both sides of the aisle to understand just how malign an actor China is, and what China's doing with the 5G technology, what they attempted to do, and how we were able to stop that, and how we are going to have to work with American companies to get them to understand more than just the bottom line, and more than just it's not just about dollars and cents. It's going to be about what are we doing for the long-term economic security of this country. And if we don't start implementing some of this legislation on the export control front, I think we're going to have a real hard time protecting those companies from walking right into the lion's mouth and having their technology stolen, and having them being priced out of the market going forward. So I think we really have to have these controls. I think what McCall is doing is exactly what he should be doing. And I'm far more comfortable talking about the Homeland Security matrix portion of it, but what they're doing on the foreign affairs side of things is something that I think we need to do. Look, we're not looking to get into conflicts, but we are looking to protect our interests. And I think it's kind of interesting in a way why they would be taking this more conciliatory approach legislatively towards China when China is engaged in genocide as we speak. What are we doing? Why would we be sanctioning them? Why would we be accepting goods? And I'm glad Homeland Security is playing some role in trying to prevent some of those goods that have been generated through some of the malign actions, especially with respect to the Uyghurs. What are we doing? We should be stopping that stuff. The withhold release orders are a very potent weapon. We need to do more of that. And I think with export controls, we need to have the same mindset. And it's up to us in conversations like this to get people to understand the bigger picture.
I wholeheartedly agree. I'll tell you a quick anecdote to reinforce this. If we're gonna wait for industry to stop trying to sell to China, we're gonna be waiting for a very long time. I had a conversation with some conversation with senior leaders in the semiconductor industry who are very, very concerned about the progress that China is making in this field, which is one of the most strategic fields in technology, of course. And when I asked them point blank, what should the U.S. government be doing to raise competitiveness U.S. industry, their immediate response was get rid of export control so we can sell more to China, which was just mind-boggling to me, but shows you how they're only focused on the short-term effects and how to get the most money. And understandably, China is a big market, and losing that has implications for domestic industry, but we have to find another way. Maureen?
Well, and another way is actually to think about not just, we can limit exports to China, but we also have to think about where we do want to trade and who we do want to trade with. so we can give companies an opportunity to not lose that market share that they might have otherwise. And one way we can, if I can toss the ball back to the Prime Minister, is by expanding our agreements with friendlies. Mr. Turnbull was a real champion of picking up the TPP and creating a CPTPP. I'd love to hear his thoughts on expansion of trade in the Pacific, and in particular, what role the United States has to play in his view, and what we think is an appropriate counterbalance to the RCEP agreement.
Yeah, well, thank you, Maureen. Look, RCEP is a very low quality, old-fashioned trade deal, right? I mean, to be honest, our view here was that it didn't add very much at all from our point of view, and we probably wouldn't have bothered joining it had it not been that a lot of our ASEAN neighbours were very keen on it. It isn't a big deal. In terms of its substance. Now, the TPP, on the other hand, is a very high quality, modern trade deal. It's got environmental standards. It's got, rules about digital protection, digital in intellectual property and so forth. It's and it was largely, it actually arose originally between discussions, I think, between Singapore and New Zealand, and then the Obama administration, took the lead on it, and it was very much an Obama project. Now, free trade deals are always unpopular domestically, but probably not in Australia. I think the Australian public have got a good understanding that, more trade means more jobs. So, but most countries are unpopular domestically. But Obama, I think, was right in seeing it as a strategic play. Now, Trump promised to pull out of it in the context of an election campaign. He didn't think he was going to win. And after he became president, I sought to persuade him, as did Abe, to stay in. And interestingly, when I explained to Trump the strategic implications of the TPP, basically creating a rules of the road, transparency, eliminating behind the border barriers to trade, all of that stuff in the area, creating our rules of the road, Donald had not, he said he'd never heard that argument for it before, which was interesting. Anyway, he whatever you say about Trump, he did stick to a lot of it. If he said he was going to pull out of a deal, he did. And everyone thought the TPP was dead. Literally no one thought it had any life in it. But John Key and I, who was then the PM of New Zealand, thought we may as well give it a go. And we sort of thought, well, people will say we're flogging a dead horse, which they did. But I figured that if the horse was dead, it wouldn't mind the flogging. So we kept going with it. And I talked Abe around. He actually here in this, where I am in our house here in Sydney. And it was actually quite liberating, because a lot of, in this part of the world, a lot of people sort of, in the absence of American leadership, they think, my God, there's not much you can do. But it was great to keep that trade deal alive. The Canadians wanted to add, the price of keeping them on board was adding the words comprehensive and progressive to it, so to make it more of a mouthful. I never understood what those two adjectives added, really. But the bottom line is that it's there. And so America's got a free option. So at some point, America could rejoin. The Brits have applied to join. Thailand will certainly join. South Korea, if the Japanese and the South Koreans can, be nice to each other, South Korea will join, and it will become a much bigger trade deal. And I think, essentially, a lot of people thought we were sort of poking a finger at Trump by keeping going with it. Quite the contrary. I used to say to everyone, I say, Trump's a businessman. He's smart enough to know the value of an option. And so keeping it alive was very important. But it's, you're absolutely right, Maureen. It's, I think it was one of Obama's defense secretaries who said it's strategically, it's got the value of it's more valuable than an additional carrier task group. So I think it'd be good for the US to rejoin. Hope it does.
Mr. Congressman, when you hear Mr. Prime Minister talk about so much about the need to support Australia in this effort, what do you see as the things that we can be doing here in America, both from Congress perspective, but also from an American public perspective, to give Australia more support as they're confronting this really incredible onslaught, essentially a declaration of trade war in a way from China?
Well, first of all, I want to take a step back, and if I haven't made it clear already, make it perfectly clear that what Australia did by standing up to China is exactly what leadership is all about. And they showed real strength and real resolve and standing up for what they believe are real profound wrongs, both economically and from a human rights standpoint. And I can do nothing but applaud that. But I think the number what the Prime Minister is getting at is that firm and strong trade alliances are whether they're informal agreements or not, are really important. Doing business with from a supply chain standpoint with partners that you can trust and partners you can work with are very important. I mean, we can't have another time in the United States, and I don't think Australia wants it either, where we have to be reliant on actors like China for sole source of supply, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100% of any product, whether it be personal protective equipment or whether it be computer chip manufacturing. So to the extent that we can identify the critical areas of supply chain in particular and trade in general, and then with those areas, strengthen those ties so that China has less of a stranglehold on things. And like we said earlier, business is always going to take the path of least resistance and make money, right? And so it's going to be a tension with some of the private sector, I'm sure, but developing these relationships like we have, like with the Quad and with the others, and enhancing them and making them stronger makes China a little bit less relevant, right? And we can't be at a point where, my biggest fear right now is that what if China decides to go into Taiwan? What happens to our computer chip availability, which is already a shortage now? What do we do then, right? And so we've got to work with countries that we can trust for the long haul, like Australia and the others, and develop this technologies and this capabilities so that we don't have to worry so much about whether or not China decides to punish us because we happen to stand up to them like Australia did. If Australia could punish China more, they would. If China could punish Australia more, they would right now. And we got to avoid that from happening. And the only way we can do it is to strengthen trade agreements, whether formal or informal, and understanding that we're all in this together, right? And we understand from a business standpoint, cash is king, but we got to get them past that to get them to understand that it's more than just that. It's economic security long term.
That's right. So you mentioned the Quad, Congressman. We actually have a question from General David Petraeus, one of our co-chairs of the Strategic Council, of course, along with the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. And the question is, for the Prime Minister, what is your sense of the prospect for actions by the Quad, and also the limits it likely will exhibit?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Dimitri. Thank you, David. Look, just to recap what I said earlier, India's got a long history of non-alignment. And so it is nudging, if you like, or inching, to closer military cooperation with, the United States in particular, Japan and Australia. I think there is and David would know vastly more about this than me, but there is an issue about, equipment. Systems. I mean, India has been Russia's biggest export customer for military sales, and yet the Chinese and Russian defense industries are becoming more integrated. And the Russians have had IP problems. I mean, Dimitri, you may have some particular insights into this. They've had real IP problems with the Chinese too, by the way. So, but it is a I think that is, that's a big area of opportunity. But India is not going to rush into a mutual defense treaty with the United States, that's for sure. But I think it's we're exercising together, we're talking together. The relationship is becoming much closer. And India and its foreign policy tended to look north and west rather than east. And I think that is, again, that's a change. I mean, there's a lot of system differences. I mean, the Indian Foreign Service, their equivalent of the State Department is tiny. They've got a very, very small diplomatic footprint. And yet their international influence potentially is enormous, not simply because they're, the largest country by population now, and demography is destiny, as we know, but also because of the enormous Indian diaspora everywhere in the world. So there is a India. We talk about the sort of the sleeping giant, channeling Napoleon, of China has woken. I think India's got there's a lot yet to be told in that story. Very different country though. It doesn't have the same sense of unity. China's overwhelmingly one ethnicity, Han, 95% or something like that. And of course they speak one language, at least one written language, and there is one national language. That's not the case in India. So very, very different. Having said that, it's a democracy, with all of its imperfections and crazinesses, and none of us are immune to that. It is a democracy. It's implausible and almost miraculous that it has survived as a democracy, but it has. Deserves a lot of support and solidarity.
Congressman Kako, we had a momentous day happen yesterday with the confirmation of Jen Easterly as the new director of CISA, turning our attention to cyber for a moment, as cyber is becoming such a huge issue now on the international stage. Obviously, the ransomware attacks from Russian-speaking groups are taking up all the attention, but China has not gone away. And we've forgotten already that only 3 months ago, we had this devastating attack from Chinese groups on Microsoft Exchange servers that have impacted over 100,000 organizations in the United States and hundreds of thousands globally. What do you want to see from Jen and CISA going forward? What authorities do you think they should have to help protect the homeland?
Well, I mean, to me, 5 years ago when I first started, 6 years ago when I first started in Congress, I would have said that the most preeminent threat to our country is foreign-inspired acts of terrorism in the U.S., especially with respect to ISIS and what they were doing. I would say now that cybersecurity is the preeminent threat. And CISA right now is not where it should be from a size and capability standpoint to deal with that threat. So I've been advocating that for a dramatic buildup in the resources for CISA so that they can meet this new threat. And it is a preeminent threat to our country. And so I think the skeletal outline of what we have right now for our cybersecurity apparatus is really starting to take root. Yeah, and I kind of looking at a team concept, so forgive me for this, but I look at CISA as kind of the quarterback of the .gov domain and the civilian domain. Then you have the Department of Defense having offensive and defensive capabilities, but then you have the intel community as the special teams. But we have a head coach now with Chris Inglis as a national cyber director, and I think that's critically important because we need someone that's looking at not just cyber defenses or offensive capabilities or defensive capabilities, but looking at everything. And CISA's job is not so much to look at the offensive capabilities, it's to look at the defensive capabilities. We need someone who's looking at all those component parts and then understanding what to do with them going forward. And I think it's critically important that Easterly is a terrific choice for head of CISA, but CISA needs to do better to interact with the private sector, and we need to give the private sector more reasons to want to work with CISA, because the more they work together, the better. And I just had a roundtable discussion in Syracuse and invited people to talk about this issue. And I had about 50 different entities from state and local government to local businesses come, and all concerned about the cybersecurity issue. And a lot of them walked away impressed of what CISA can do to help them. So CISA is going to play a major role in our cybersecurity matrix going forward. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon private sector to take up a partnership, a public-private partnership, if you will. But it's also incumbent upon the private sector to get their act together and understand that hardening your cyber defenses after you've been hacked means you're already lost, right? And we've got to do the hardening on the front end. And there's a lot more we can do on the front end to help these companies avoid these attacks going forward. And so there's a lot. She's at the tip of the spear, and we're going to be there every step of the way to help her every way we can. I couldn't give a damn whether she's a Democrat or Republican. She's an American, just like I am. We want to do what's right no matter what for America going forward.
That's right. And she's, as you know, a veteran as well, having served a long career in the U.S. Army, served in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. So just a tremendous leader for CISA, and thank you for your support of her and the department and CISA as the agency as well. And I also want to compliment you, Mr. Prime Minister, for choosing a magnificent individual in your time as Prime Minister, our mutual friend, Mike Burgess, as the head of ASD, the Australian version of NSA, who is probably one of the most leading thinkers on cybersecurity issues in the world, not just in Australia, and has done just an absolutely marvelous job in his tenure while he was at ASD.
Yeah, he has. He's outstanding. Yeah.
All right.
Great, thanks everyone. This discussion has been very constructive, and I think it's forged several paths forward for us to think about with our collective friends. I think the first thought is very simple: stick with your friends. Collective counterweights matter. The second is, technology is both an accelerant of risk and also an accelerant of opportunity, and cyber presents a new and important battlefield. Next to final point is that economic security is homeland security, and we need to be viewing that lens and communicating it broadly, both with our friends internationally and domestically with our stakeholders at home, including U.S. business. And final and most importantly, the rules of cricket will always remain a mystery to Americans.
No doubt.
Thank you for your leadership, both of you, and thank you, Chairman Barra. Sorry we can play the video, but it will be posted on our website. And I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thanks
evening.
very much.